Hello, everyone. Let's see if I'm doing this correctly. Okay, I don't know if you can see me or not, but it doesn't really matter. I just wanted to jump in to kind of looking through a poem today, very famous poem, just to give you a kind of sense of what we're looking for when we try to identify things in poetry, how we break down its formal aspects, how we break down its levels of meaning, and then just give you a kind of generalized sense of what we're looking for. Okay, when we read a poem. The poem that we'll be looking at today is a poem by John Keats, a very famous British poet, and the poem is called Ode on a Grecian Urn, sometimes Ode to a Grecian Urn. Either way, not a big deal. And then what we're looking at or contemplating is something like this. You know, these, if you've ever seen these in a museum, they're really, really cool. And they depict these scenes, sometimes war, sometimes the gods, the muses, mythical figures like a satyr right here, sometimes athletic competitions. Here's one. This is probably, if I had to guess, from the Iliad. But yeah, you can see here all these kinds of different paintings that occur on these Grecian urns. So I'm going to read through the poem, and then we're going to break down its constituent elements, give you a little background on it and on Keats, and then that will be that. Ode on a Grecian Urn. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape of deities or mortals, or of both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? What men or gods are these? What maidens loth? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on. Not to the sensual ear, but, more endeared, pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. Fair youth, beneath the trees, thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can those trees be bare. Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal yet, do not grieve. She cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss, for ever wilt thou love, and she be fair. Ah, happy, happy boughs, that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu, and happy melodist, unwearied, forever piping songs forever new. More happy love, more happy, happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young, all breathing human passion far above, that leaves a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Who are these coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar? O mysterious priest, leadst thou that heifer lowing at the skies, and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed? What little town by river or seashore, or mountain built with peaceful citadel, is emptied of this folk this pious morn? And little town, thy streets forevermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate can e'er return. O Attic shape, fair attitude, with breed of marble men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches and the trodden weed, thou silent form dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity, cold pastoral. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain, in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou say'st, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know. Really, really lovely poem. And so let's break it down. Where are my notes? Have they disappeared? One moment, I have to pause this. All right, so let me make these a little bigger so they're easy to read. So I'm going to go through this, kind of give you a little background on what kind of poem we're looking at, what it's doing, and then we'll turn to the poem and look at some of the constituent elements that go on inside the poem. This poem is what we call an ekphrastic poem. Okay, ekphrastic comes from the Greek, although it's not, if I remember correctly, it's not an original Greek term. I think it was coined in the 1800s, if I'm remembering correctly, and it just means a description, ek and phrasis, or kind of saying out or saying at something. It's a poem. An ekphrastic poem is a poem about another work of art. Okay. Typically, these are poems about the visual arts, like a painting, sculpture, an urn in this case, but it really could be about any other genre or medium. So if you were writing a poem about a movie, let's say, that would technically be an ekphrastic poem. Now, it's also what's called an apostrophic poem. Now, apostrophe in this sense, in the literary sense, means that the poem is addressing someone or something. It comes from apo, excuse me, which means like away or away from, and then strephein, which means to turn. Okay, so in that sense, we're turning away from, let's say, the poem toward, or the work of art toward the poem. Okay, it's like you have an apostrophic moment in a poem where the speaker will say, "Oh, reader," right, directly addressing you or somebody outside the poem. Okay, that's what's called an apostrophic moment. So the ekphrastic form, technically, even though the terminology is relatively new, it goes back to at least the Latin poet Horace, whom I highly recommend you read. He's most famous for his odes. We'll talk about an ode here in a moment. Okay. Now, there can be three levels of address in an ekphrastic poem. They can do basically one of three things. One is the mimetic level, okay, the mimetic address, and that's describing what the other work of art is doing, okay. The other level can be formal, and that's describing the constituent elements, of that work of art. If we're talking about a painting, it might be, the color scheme used, the use of line. If you look at, for example, if you look at the French artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ong versus Eugene Delacroix, he's considered a classic classic painter. Delacroix is a romantic painter, and you can see how their use of line is very different. I like both of them a lot. The other level that we'd look at in an ekphrastic poem is the formal. I'm sorry. The level of signification. That is to say, what does this work of art mean? So I'm repeating myself. Delacroix should go here. So we have the mimetic, and you can see there mimesis, to mime, to repeat, to kind of copy, to ape. Then the formal, and then the signification level. Okay, these are not mutually exclusive. A poem can do all three. It can do one. It can do two out of the three. It doesn't really matter. It's a mix and match kind of grab bag. But that's what the basis of an ekphrastic poem seeks to do. Okay. Now, a little bit about Keats. I don't want to do too much bio on him, but he was born in 1795, and he died in 1821 at the age of 25. He is, even though he died very, very young, he is considered one of the most important literary figures in English, and he was part of the Romantic movement. Now, the Romantic movement overlaps several different fields, genres. You have the philosophical Romantic movement, you have the literary, visual arts, music even at the time, and so Romanticism itself is rather vague. It's like modernism. A student asked me once, how do you define modernism versus postmodernism? And I thought, well, that's a good question because, we had a long discussion about it. So Romanticism is a very broad term, okay? It does have a few important features that do kind of sync between the various fields and genres. It's marked by a distinct attachment to nature through the mind, through the self, through the word, the work of art, whatever it be, okay? So there's a sense of like a return to nature, okay? It has a subtle or even overtly stated aversion to science. Now, it's not to say that it's necessarily always hostile to science, but the Romantics were reacting to figures like Isaac Newton, the scientific and mathematical advances that were going on in the 1700s. We saw the birth of the scientific method. We saw Newton write the Principia, which sought to basically explain the universe. How does the universe work, right? And what they saw, the Romantics, is that science was making the universe, and therefore nature, okay, too mechanistic, too much like a clock or a machine. And it sort of, for them, it stripped out a lot of the beauty, a lot of the kind of mystery that we find when we look out into nature. We look at the stars, we look at, the diversity of peoples and plants and animals on the earth, and we say, oh, that's really amazing. How mysterious, how beautiful. And so they wanted to kind of kick science out of the discussion, okay? So certain figures like William Blake, I'll mention him in a moment, very hostile to science. Others kind of teased it. Wordsworth plays around with it. Shelley is somewhat hostile. Coleridge, I think, probably is the most scientific of all of them. But anyway, the other important factor is the self, the individual, okay? The individual as a kind of important figure, the speaker of the poem, the sense of the I, very, very important to the Romantics. So the self is individual, the individual is self, however you want to say it, okay? There was also a resurgence of interest in Greek literature and art at this time. It's too long of a story to really get into, but this idea of antiquity. And right around this time, you would have seen the rise of folks like Napoleon, okay? And what that did was usher in this kind of new interest, especially in Egypt through Napoleon, but also in Greek statues, literature, art, etc. Okay, so some of the big names you have to know from the Romantic period, obviously John Keats, but there was another guy, Percy Bysshe Shelley, famously married to Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. She wrote Frankenstein, and it's a very, very interesting book, very different from most of the movie versions you've probably seen or are familiar with. The monster in that book is not some shambling, creature that can't speak. He's actually very eloquent, and it's all about, right, this competition between science and, you could say, nature. The creature Frankenstein has, assembled this creature, brought it back to life, and now this creature is stuck, in this kind of limbo between death and life. It's not really alive, but it's also not really dead. And so you see there that conflict that I mentioned with the Romantics, where the science versus nature itself, right? Mankind thinking that we can, or humankind thinking that we can beat nature through science, right? And this is an old theme. This goes back to, I mean, at least Gilgamesh, and the idea of culture and civilization versus human nature, nature in general, all that sort of thing. So Shelley was a friend of Keats. Shelley died also very young in a boating accident, but he was married to Mary Shelley, very, very famous couple. Some of his most famous works, probably his most famous work is Ode to the West Wind, but he also wrote a sonnet called Ozymandias, which I'll talk about in another lecture. One of my favorite poems of all time. There's George Gordon, most commonly known as Lord Byron. I will not go into his biography, but let's just say he was a bit of a ladies' man and got himself in some trouble along the way because of it. But one of his most famous longer poems is called Don Juan, and I highly recommend you read it if you have a chance. It's good. I'm not a huge fan of Byron as much as I am of Shelley and Keats or Coleridge or Wordsworth or Blake, but he's a great poet in his own right. And these are not in any sort of chronological order. Okay, I just threw the names out as they came up. Next, you have Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Perhaps, if I had to say, probably the smartest of the Romantic bunch. He was reputed to have a photographic memory, and kind of crippled himself with laudanum. He was a laudanum addict. I forgot to put up Kubla Khan. So his most famous poem was Rime of the Ancient Mariner. He wrote a very interesting autobiography. He's considered one of the great interpreters of Shakespeare. He loved Shakespeare, wrote some books about it, or about him, and like ways of interpreting Shakespeare, ways to understand it, and very, very insightful guy. And Kubla Khan, another famous poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. William Wordsworth, I believe he's the one who lived the longest. He had a very long life. Very interesting fellow. Sort of loosely associated or affiliated with the French Revolution when he was younger. Kind of moved around Europe for a while, ends up settling back in Britain. One of his most famous poems is Ode on Intimations of Immortality, and then another one is Lines Composed a Few Miles North of Tintern Abbey. He was very prolific. He wrote a lot of poems, a lot of books, and I highly recommend looking into these poets when you have a chance. These, to answer somebody else's question, I would put all of these guys and Mary Shelley on a list of books you gotta, or at least authors you have to be familiar with as an English major. And then you have William Blake, who is, he's kind of lumped in with the Romantics. He had a very, very different sensibility. If you go and read his poems, they do not sound like anything else from the other Romantics. Like, he's very, very idiosyncratic. He's actually a very idiosyncratic guy. He claims that as a child he had a vision of a bunch of angels sitting in a tree, kind of talking, and this led him down a path of, he's a very devout Christian, but his views on Christianity were very unique, not to say heretical, but very unique, shall we say. His most famous book is Poems of Experience and Poems of Innocence and Poems of Experience. There's another kind of, well, how to put it? It's almost like a giant prose poem, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. It's a very beautiful book, very weird. But if you have a chance to check out his paintings, he was a very, very good illustrator and painter. And his paintings, I mean, I'm sure you've seen one of them somewhere and just didn't know it was Blake. But they're really, really impressive, very, very fascinating. And his two books here, these were basically self-published, and he did illustrations for them. So he would print the illustrations like on wood blocks, and then set the poems inside of the pages. So if you ever have a chance to look at a facsimile of these poems, you can kind of see that it's almost like a hypertext, where the poems and the visuals, the paintings themselves, are meant to kind of interplay. They're meant to kind of interact on the page. But this is not a lecture on Blake. So all these guys are central figures in the English poetic tradition, not just the Romantic tradition, but the English poetic tradition. As I said, Keats died the youngest of them all at 25. He did not make it to his 26th birthday. And so you see this theme a lot in Keats, probably more than just about any other author, because he had trained to be a doctor, and he caught tuberculosis, I think when he was around like 19 or 20. And so tuberculosis back then was a death sentence. Like there was no cure for it. Even today, we don't really have a cure for it. We just have treatment. And so he knew he was dying, and he was in pretty rough shape by the end. And when they did a post-mortem autopsy on him, the doctors were actually flabbergasted that he had managed to survive that long, because they said his lungs were basically just tissue paper, because tuberculosis basically creates, it turns your lungs into Swiss cheese, and you cough up blood. It's pretty nasty. But tuberculosis was very common at this time, up through the 1800s. And just to give you an example of this, had Shakespeare died at 25, Shakespeare, the most famous English author, had he died at 25, we probably wouldn't know anything about him. He hadn't really produced his greatest works yet. He'd produced some kind of minor, plays that we look at and we say, oh, that's Shakespeare, but really they're not as good as what came later. So it's pretty remarkable. But this idea of death, of getting, there's a poem that Keats wrote that starts off, when I have fears that I may cease to be before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain. He wants to try to get everything out on the page that's in his mind. And so he worked obsessively in the last couple of years of his life, and is a really, really just titanic poet. So the ode that we just looked at, he wrote this poem in May 1819. 1819, 1820, these are years of incredible output for Keats. I mean, just like an obsessive output from him. Now, when we look at the ode, okay, it comes from the Greek word eide, or what is it in Greek? Edein, I think. It just means to sing. Okay, so it's something. It's an old form. I'm not sure if I'd call it a form exactly. It's definitely a kind of subgenre because there's no real structure or formal aspect that an ode has to have in English to be called an ode. You basically can just title anything ode, and it becomes an ode. Okay, but the basic point of an ode is to celebrate an object, an idea, to elevate it in some way. So here Keats takes a Grecian urn, right, a piece of pottery, and elevates it into something beyond itself. You could think of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Ode am Freiheit, the Ode to Joy, very, very beautiful piece. Other poets, later poets, 20th century poet Pablo Neruda wrote a very good book of odes, but he wrote about very mundane things. One of the poems, one of my favorite poems, it's called Ode to My Socks, right? So here he's not talking about joy or art itself, right? It's just my socks. So Neruda's really great. If you speak Spanish, he's even better if you can read him in the original, but there are some very good translations of his work. I highly recommend him, especially The Heights of Machu Picchu, one of the great poems of the 20th century. So Keats's poem is an ekphrastic apostrophic ode. Some fancy sounding terms, but we all know what these mean now. And to answer one quick question that I think some people have, Keats wasn't talking about any specific Greek urn. Like, he was aware of them; they would have been in museums at the time. But nobody's been able to identify a specific urn that he's talking about. So he kind of just imagines this urn, makes it up for the poem to suit the poem, and then writes this ode. So what's the poem's shape? So we have 5 stanzas. You can see that, 5 individual kind of sections. There are 10 lines each, and they contain 1 quatrain and 1 sestet. You can look at the rhyme scheme to figure this out. Okay. Ness, express, time, rhyme, shape, escape, loth, both, arcady, ecstasy. Notice he's using a lot of near rhymes. He's not doing a lot of perfect rhymes here, which I think makes the poem a lot more powerful, because he's not drawing as much attention to the perfect rhymes. But what's easy to miss, since I haven't really talked about it, is that these are, each stanza is technically what we call a curtal, C-U-R-T-A-L, and that's basically a sonnet that has been kind of cut a little bit. So a curtal can be like 10 lines, 12 lines. A normal sonnet has to be 14 to be officially a sonnet. I haven't talked about form yet, so but most people, especially English majors, know what a sonnet at least kind of looks like. Okay, but that a shorter sonnet is called a curtal. So the poem personifies the urn in its initial address. Thou still unravished bride, right? Thou, the you in the poem is the urn. Okay, then it moves to describing the scene on the urn, right? So we have 2 of those levels of ekphrasis that we were talking about earlier, right? And then later in the poem, it then again addresses the urn, okay? In the last part of the poem, the last 2 lines, that last, the ending, the urn speaks, right? We saw those quotation marks around the those last 2 lines, and to whom thou sayest, so a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, right? And then this is generally accepted as the kind of common reading of that last bit. This is the urn speaking not just to the speaker, but rather to the reader. Okay, so just like the poem itself, right, in describing the urn, right, becomes the urn, and the poem becomes the thing through the urn, through art itself, speaking to the reader. Okay, hence the quotation marks. So if we look at just kind of formally, what is each stanza doing? The first and fourth stanzas employ a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions that he's asking, and they don't necessarily get answered. And I think that's a good thing. A lot of people get confused by ambiguity in literature, and ambiguity is simply something you have to be comfortable with. You're just going to have to accept it as part of the reality of reading literature, that good literature doesn't come out and just directly tell you, like, oh, this is the meaning of life, right? It hints at it, it suggests things, will contradict itself, and these ambiguities are where we like to sit when we're interpreting literature in general. So the second stanza uses a lot of statements. The third stanza uses exclamations quite a bit. Like I said, the fourth has a lot of questions. And then the last stanza, the fifth, turns back again to statements. So there's an interesting kind of self-investigation happening in the poem. There are questions raised, somewhat addressed, somewhat answered, but not really. There are several paradoxes that Keats uses to make clear the ambiguity, right? So I know that's a bit of an oxymoron, because ambiguity is anything but clear. Paradoxes are anything but an answer. But that's the fun part of literature. So if we look at the first stanza, and like I said, when you read these out loud, it'll be a lot more evident what's going on. But if you look at how the language changes, it becomes quite nervous in that first stanza, almost like an ecstatic use of language. right? So this is something that once you're comfortable reading out loud and you can kind of hear the words on the page, you'll pick that up. The author might speed up the language, might speed up the sound effects, might kind of slow them down, like with the gutturals or velars. And that is a way of, or a key inside to the speaker's mind, the poet's mind, the poem's mind. Okay. The second stanza's statements and descriptions seek to apply or find the answers to the questions. They kind of do and kind of don't. In the third, the speaker is directly talking to this lover and this piper, okay, that are depicted on the urn. So in this sense, what you have to understand, and I should have drawn this out prior, I apologize for not doing so. If we think of the urn, right? There's an urn, very urn shaped, right? On one of the scenes, there's a guy kind of chasing this woman, right? And so you notice that he's in pursuit, but he never catches her, right? It's like a photograph of this moment, okay? So this is part of one of these paradoxes that Keats evokes, right? That though this work is, pardon me, I'm getting emails. Though the work is static, right, it is in motion, okay? Though the piper is not really playing the instrument, he is playing. You see that so it is and isn't. It's true and false simultaneously. So these paradoxes are loaded into this poem and quite intentionally. So the lover, right, he never catches her, but, you know, in that sense of what Keats is saying, you know, the love lasts forever, right? Instead of like with normal people, you know, oh, you catch the guy, you catch the girl, and then, oh, you break up. But oh no, right here for Keats, this remains immortal, okay? So in the sense that art is immortal and is not, right? Art is itself artificial. It's not really people. It's not real. I mean, the poem is not really anything. It's just a poem. It addresses certain things. So it's true and false simultaneously. The truths that we find in literature, the truths that we find in a poem, a great poem, are universal but also local, both simultaneously. And so you just have to be comfortable with that when reading, especially poems that use paradoxes like Keats is doing here. Okay, I mean, art can be destroyed physically. I mean, we could take this and smash it. Right now, no more urn. But art also exists as an ideal, beauty as an ideal, almost this metaphysical level. Okay, now, even though art exists as an ideal, if it lacks the physical representation, can art exist only as an idea? You see, this is where it gets quite philosophical quite quickly, because we have this idea of art, but we can't really know it until the artwork is in front of us, until it has had physical representation in some fashion. Okay, so those are some of the paradoxes Keats is playing with. We can think of art's superiority as thus its inferiority. Here's another paradox. If you've read Plato's Republic, you'll know, or I guess he explores it in some of his middle works, but it's kind of like this Platonic ideal. Okay, Plato had this idea of the forms. Yeah, I don't want to get into it, but you can go look that up. Plato's 4 forms. So there's something that exists in the mind. Okay, we can have this idea in our mind, like the perfect right angle triangle. Okay, we can say, oh, okay, right angle triangle, and we can, use the Pythagorean theorem to calculate it. The moment I draw one, I have this idea in my mind, right? The moment I draw this triangle, look how terrible that is. That's supposed to be a right angle marker. I mean, that's not even a triangle, right? These lines don't even join. This line goes over. I mean, but we know that it's a triangle. So we have the idea of something, like art, but when physically represented, it's never perfect. It never lives or exemplifies the ideal that we have of it. And yet, we have to have both kind of simultaneously, or the concept itself becomes meaningless. So Keats is really drawing upon some very interesting paradoxes for this. So art for Keats shares this paradox of the immortality or superiority of art, but when composed, when written, right, when sculpted, right, it's never going to be perfect, and yet it is, and yet it isn't. So just embrace the paradox. They're quite fun. I haven't done my paradox lecture yet, but I will hopefully do that soon. Now in the fourth stanza, the speaker looks at another scene on the urn. Okay, so notice here that he's doing one of two things. He's either turning it in his hands, or like in a museum, be walking around it. Okay, so there's this participatory quality to turning this urn around or walking around it, right? Looking at it, thinking about it, interpreting it, writing about it. Okay, this other scene, and it's kind of hard to gather from his description, but basically what he's looking at is a religious procession. There's a cow being led somewhere, presumably to be sacrificed. We could even try to drag an interpretation out of this cow or this scene. I believe he calls it the heifer. We can almost look at it symbolically and not just metaphorically, much like the urn. The urn itself could mean many different things, and so therefore it's more symbolic than just metaphoric. Okay, the sacrifice of the heifer could be the sacrifice that the artist makes, the sacrifices of the work of art itself, the struggle to create, etc. If you find textual evidence in the description of that cow that you can then draw an interpretation out of. Okay, the speaker fully admits, that he cannot know where these people have come from or where they're going. Right? He asks a lot of questions. Now, in several ways that we could even read those questions here metaphorically. Okay, it could indicate a certain fear of misreading art, because we can never truly know what a particular piece or poem means. Okay, so that self-inquisition, the artist and piece of art looking at itself self-consciously as a work of art, as itself the answer to its own questions, right? That itself is just another question. You see that these layers are really piled in here for Keats. Now there's a weird exclamation in the middle of the fifth stanza, cold pastoral, he says, and it's once again this kind of paradox, and I think it's very similar to the earlier paradoxes we discussed about the urn and its depictions. Okay, pastoral here is a subject. It's sometimes called a genre, sometimes called a form. I don't know if I'd call it a mood more than anything, because there's no real form that it has to take, once again, kind of like the ode. But pastoral poetry deals with like bucolic scenes, okay? Pastures, the outdoors, nature, the swineherd, the shepherd, right? The maiden in the field, that sort of thing. And that's pastoral pretty broadly. But here the paradox of cold pastoral, okay? The work of art stirs emotions but is itself inert, okay? So it's cold, and yet it's still participating in this artistic movement. Pastoral poetry very often tends to be about romantic love and all of this. So it's doing these two things simultaneously. It kind of smashes this paradox together into just those two words, okay? Art is both alive, warm, and just an urn, cold, okay? So it's in motion, but not in motion, right? In order to see the whole thing, we have to walk around it. So therefore, the art itself is something we have to participate in, okay? The urn evokes the pastoral tradition, which is written, okay, through pictures, which is visual, and thus we have, as I said earlier, the ekphrastic poem itself. And we can note, too, the phrase, still unravished bride, okay, and the paradox this evokes. There's a double entendre on still here, okay, being that it's inert. We say that something is still, okay, be still, children, and it also means as of yet, okay. I still haven't, made $1 million from teaching, as of yet I haven't. You see that, and so he plays even there on that one word, right? He plays on that paradox, okay? Something that is still or unmoving, and then something also temporal. So here we have motion, physicality. Here we have temporal. Both of these themes and tropes, very important in this poem and a lot of Keats's other work, okay? Like I said, the urn is both eternal because of its artistic merits, and it's just an urn. Like I said, these motifs of motion and stillness, of happiness and despair, of cold and warmth, of quiet and noise, Keats is playing these opposites against each other to heighten the paradoxes that he's employing, okay? So that kind of adds to the richness of the paradoxes that Keats is using in the poem, right? Like I said earlier, in terms of the shape, the urn is round, right? And we think of that, think of the Ouroboros, right? The snake or dragon swallowing its own tail, okay? So this idea of the eternal, if we turn the urn and we look at it from above, right? So we see some of the scenes here. It's circular, it's eternal, okay? It's not linear. Even though it is depicting kind of linear things on it, right? In that sense of the shape of the urn, metaphorically, right? It's round, it's eternal. So therefore, art itself is eternal, I guess, so long as there are people to look at it, okay? The thing that ends in this sense for Keats is the speaker himself, okay? Being mortal, right? Human beings, unfortunately, tend to be mortal, and yet we think of art as being a kind of eternal thing. I mention it a lot because I'm fascinated by it, but if you go and look at the cave paintings of Lascaux or Chauvet caves in France, these are, approximately, what, I think 50 to 30,000 years old. And we can look at these paintings done by people so far removed from our modern sense of self, right? And we can still find immense beauty and immense joy in these paintings. I hope you take a moment to go look at them because they are stunningly gorgeous. I have several books on them, and I look through them quite often. So this begs a question. So all of this stuff begs a question for Keats. If art is immortal, but is created by a mortal being, why do we call it immortal at all when art, like life, is transitory, easily lost, or broken, much like human beings, you see? Keats, however, like all good poets, does not bother to answer this question. And that adds, once again, to the ambiguity. I mean, of course, he probably had an opinion on it, but he suggests things. All great literature suggests things without necessarily answering it too directly, okay? And that ambiguity, like I said, is just something we have to be comfortable with. It's not meant to be confusing. Rather, it's meant to evoke the reader to take a step back and ponder the ineffable, the eternal, and the ephemeral. Now, if we look at those last two lines, very famous ending in this poem, beauty is truth and truth beauty, right? How do we read that? Now, I talked earlier about figurative language, And we can't read those last two lines literally because the words aren't synonyms. He's saying beauty is truth. Beauty is equal to truth. Truth is equal to beauty. We have to read that figuratively, and we can pull out some meaning as to what Keats might be suggesting here. If we find beauty in truth and truth in beauty, can we be satisfied? If that's all we know, what is left thereafter? Here's the problem. Truth is a quality of language that must agree with its physical or representational counterpart. Okay? We can say that certain things are true or false. Now, I'm not going to go too far into the philosophical side of this. It is a long debate. It's a very fascinating debate. I mean, I'm not going to lie, but poetry class, not a philosophy class. But in general, we could say that truth is a quality of language. Falsity is a quality of language. If something doesn't correspond, right, to its actual physical, real world sense, well, can it still be true? Okay, we could say no. We cannot say the same of beauty in that sense, though. Why? Because standards of beauty change, they alter, it differs person to person. We ideally wouldn't say that truth is relative to whoever's looking at something, right? If you or I both look at something, we say, oh, that's true, and you say, oh, that's false, and well, one of us has to be wrong, right? But we can't say the same thing about beauty because you and I might find different things beautiful, and that's fine. Like, nobody has a problem with that. Keats slams these, in philosophy we call beauty a normative term. Normative here just means capable of being judged, of measured, debating it, whatever, okay? So Keats slams together those two words, beauty and truth, yet they are diametrically dissimilar. Beauty cannot literally be true, and truth cannot literally be beautiful. Yet, in Keats's poem, the paradoxes, the ambiguities, the contradictions all add up to create both unease and sublime satisfaction, right? Because he doesn't answer the question. He says, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know. Well, what is that it? John? Right? So there might be a certain unease in his unwillingness to give us a clearer answer than that. And yet, because of the language, because of the paradoxes, because of the ambiguities, there is a sublime satisfaction when reading this poem because it evokes all of those ideas and allows you, the reader, to ponder them for yourself, just as you, the reader, or the viewer of the urn, are participating in that artistic tradition. Okay? So when you're reading a poem, be sure to mark out those contradictions, the paradoxes, the ironies that you note, and see what the poet or writer is doing with them. Because contradictions, paradoxes, ironies, they are central tropes that authors use to tease out meaning rather than saying it straightforwardly. Okay? So I highly recommend going and looking at especially Keats's other odes and his sonnets. Those are the ones he's probably most famous for. He did write a couple of longer poems that you could comfortably skip, but in terms of his greatest hits, it's his odes and his sonnets. I'll probably return to at least one of his sonnets when I discuss that form. I'll probably look at one by Milton and one by Keats. But his odes are really beautiful, and now you can hopefully go in to his other odes, pick up on some of the tropes, and then pick up on some of the themes, right, and maneuvers that Keats uses over and over and over in his poems, because these are recurrent for his work. And that's just something that you'll find the more you read a certain author. You'll find, she writes a lot about this. The joke I always make when teaching Emily Dickinson is that if somebody asks you what her poem's about, you can say death and be correct 90% of the time. Ha ha ha. But we'll look at Dickinson here in the weeks to come. So I hope that kind of helps, kind of shows you like one way of kind of peeling back the layers and the levels of a poem. in kind of finding out how the author and how the speaker are manufacturing meaning, right? Not just through rhyme, not just through questions, not just through statements, not just through the using the curtle, for example, as a form here. This is just one poem of many, and I hope it's helpful. And further, I hope you all have a lovely day.